One film was never meant to exist. Somme, the film that hid Britain's bloodiest day. For decades, the truth stayed buried, until now. What authorities didn't want you to see, and why they tried to erase it, is about to surface. Subscribe for untold World War I stories that change everything. On the 1st of July 1916, the British Army marched toward the Somme River in northern France. What followed was not victory. What followed was the single bloodiest day in British military history. Nearly 60,000 men became casualties in those first 24 hours. 19,240 of them never came home. The generals had promised a breakthrough. They had promised that weeks of artillery bombardment would crush German defenses. They had promised that waves of soldiers advancing across open ground would seize enemy trenches and end the stalemate. Instead, machine gun fire met them. Wire entanglement stopped them. The careful plans dissolved into catastrophe. Yet within weeks, something remarkable happened. The British government released a film called The Battle of the Somme. It was a blockbuster. Audiences packed theaters across the nation. They watched footage of soldiers marching toward the front lines. They saw trenches and artillery and movement. What they did not see was the truth. The film was propaganda designed to recruit more men into an army that was bleeding itself dry. Censors had carefully controlled every frame, every image, every narrative. They transformed a disaster into a story of sacrifice and duty. They hid the horror behind cinema. This is the story of how a nation processed its worst military catastrophe through the lens of film, how moving pictures became tools of state control, how one of history's greatest tragedies was repackaged and sold back to a grieving public as something noble and necessary. The men who marched toward the Somme in the summer of 1916 were not expecting what would find them there. They were soldiers of the British Empire, drawn from every corner of a nation stretched across continents, assembled into regiments with names that carried centuries of history. Many were volunteers, men who had answered the call to arms with patriotic fervor in the months following the declaration of war in August of 1914. Others were conscripts, drafted into service as the grinding machinery of industrial warfare consumed men faster than any recruitment drive could replace them. What united them was a fundamental misunderstanding of what awaited in northern France. The strategic context that led to the Somme offensive emerged from the brutal stalemate that had calcified across the Western Front. For nearly 2 years, British and French forces had faced German troops across a landscape of trenches, barbed wire, and devastation. The war had evolved into something neither side had anticipated, a contest of attrition rather than maneuver, where territorial gains measured in yards came at costs measured in thousands of lives. General Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, believed that the solution to this impasse lay in concentration and overwhelming force. A massive coordinated assault by British and French armies could, he theorized, break through German lines and restore movement to a war that had become paralyzed. The planning for the offensive had consumed months. Military strategists pored over maps and intelligence reports, calculating artillery requirements and troop deployments. The French, under General Joseph Joffre, would contribute forces south of the Somme River. The British, under Haig's command, would attack to the north of the river. Together they would create a hammer blow so powerful that German defenses would shatter. The plan reflected the military thinking of the age: massive concentration of firepower, preceded by an unprecedented artillery bombardment intended to obliterate German trenches, and barbed wire before a single infantryman went over the top. The artillery preparation began on the 24th of June, 1916. For 7 days, British guns pounded the German positions with a fury that had never been seen before in human warfare. Over 1,500,000 shells rained down on German lines, creating a bombardment of such intensity that it could be heard across the English Channel. The ground itself seemed to convulse beneath this weight of metal and explosive force. Military commanders were confident that nothing could survive such punishment. Surely, they reasoned, the German trenches would be obliterated, the barbed wire cut to pieces, the defenders killed or driven to madness by the relentless assault. But the Germans understood something that the British commanders had not fully grasped. Their trenches were deep, far deeper than intelligence reports had suggested. The artillery bombardment, for all its awesome power, largely passed over the German front lines, tearing up the earth and destroying the landscape, but leaving the carefully constructed defensive positions largely intact. When the bombardment finally ceased on the 1st of July, the German soldiers emerged from their dugouts, climbed to their fire steps, and prepared their machine guns. The 1st of July, 1916, dawned as a summer morning in France, the kind of day that in peacetime might have brought pleasure to those who witnessed it. The weather was clear and warm. The British infantry, carrying heavy packs and supplies, began their advance toward the German lines at 7:30 in the morning. They walked, not ran, maintaining formation and discipline as they had been trained to do. They expected little resistance. The artillery had done its work, they believed. Victory was simply a matter of walking across the devastated ground and occupying the German trenches. The machine gun fire began almost immediately. Concentrated, disciplined, and devastating, German gunners cut down the advancing British soldiers in rows. The men fell by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Those who survived the initial volleys pressed forward, struggling across ground torn by shell craters and tangled with barbed wire that the bombardment had failed to cut. They climbed over the wire, many of them snagging on it and becoming easy targets. The German fire was relentless and accurate. Behind the German trenches, officers watched the British advance with grim satisfaction. It was almost too easy. By nightfall on that 1st of July, the British Army had suffered approximately 57,000 to 60,000 casualties, including 19,240 killed. No single day in British military history had exacted such a price. Entire regiments had been decimated. Villages across Britain would awaken in the following days to discover that a significant portion of their young men had been killed or wounded in a matter of hours. Families received telegrams. Casualty lists grew longer with each passing day. The scale of the disaster was almost incomprehensible. Yet the battle did not end on that first day. The offensive would continue for 141 days, stretching from early July through mid-November of 1916. Throughout this period, British and French forces would continue to attack German positions, gaining small amounts of territory at enormous cost. The British would eventually deploy tanks for the first time in military history at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette in September, a tactical innovation that offered hope for breaking the stalemate but achieved only limited results. The German army, meanwhile, would stand firm, contesting every yard and inflicting their own terrible casualties on the attackers. The human cost would be staggering. By the time the battle officially ended on the 18th of November, the British Army would suffer an estimated 419,000 to 420,000 casualties. The French would suffer approximately 194,000 to 204,000 casualties. The German casualties, though difficult to calculate precisely, would be substantial as well. For these losses, the Allies would gain territory measured in miles, rather than the breakthrough they had sought. This was the context in which a cinematographer named Geoffrey Mellins and his camera would find themselves. As the battle raged across the muddy fields and shattered villages of the Somme, someone in the British military establishment made a decision. The public needed to understand what their soldiers were experiencing. The war needed to be documented, recorded, and presented to the British people. A film would be made, a documentary record of the greatest military effort in British history. What no one could have anticipated was that this film would become something far more significant than a simple record of events. It would become a document of how a nation processed unimaginable tragedy and how the truth of war could be shaped and presented to serve different purposes. The dawn of July 1st, 1916, broke across the Somme Valley with a silence that would not last. For 7 days and nights, the British artillery had pounded the German trenches without pause. Over 1 million shells had torn into the earth, a bombardment of such scale that officers believed nothing could survive it. The generals were confident. The infantry would walk across no man's land and occupy the devastated German positions. Victory, they assured themselves, was merely a matter of following the barrage. At 7:30 in the morning, the whistles blew across the British lines. 110,000 men climbed out of their trenches and began their walk toward the German wire. They advanced in straight lines, shoulder to shoulder, weighed down by 60 pounds of equipment each. They moved slowly, deliberately, as they had been trained. Behind them came the reserve battalions, ready to exploit the breakthrough that commanders assured them would come. The German soldiers emerged from their deep dugouts as the bombardment lifted. They had survived. The artillery, while devastating to the landscape, had failed to destroy the carefully constructed fortifications or cut the barbed wire that stretched across no man's land. The German machine gunners, seasoned veterans of the Eastern Front, took their positions and waited. They had clear fields of fire across the flat, open ground where the British now advanced. The slaughter began immediately. Machine gun fire, methodical and relentless, cut through the advancing ranks. Men fell by the thousands. Some made it 50 yards. Others reached the wire and were caught there, struggling to find gaps in the entanglement while bullets found their bodies. There was no shelter, no cover, no escape. The open ground became a killing field. British soldiers, brave and disciplined, continued to advance because they had been ordered to advance, because retreat was unthinkable, because they could see no alternative but to keep moving forward into the fire. By noon, the slaughter had reached incomprehensible proportions. Nearly 20,000 British soldiers lay dead or dying on the Somme battlefield. Another 37,000 were wounded. The casualty figures accumulated with a speed that would have seemed impossible mere hours earlier. Stretcher bearers moved through the carnage, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of wounded men. Field hospitals, prepared for thousands of casualties, found themselves inadequate for tens of thousands. The medical services, for all their preparation, could not cope with the scale of destruction. Yet, the fighting did not stop. July 1st became July 2nd, and the attacks continued. The British commanders, faced with the catastrophic failure of their initial assault, made a decision that would haunt military history. They ordered the attacks to continue. Perhaps they reasoned one more push would break through. Perhaps the German defenses were weakening. Perhaps persistence would achieve what the initial assault had failed to accomplish. The July and August months that followed became a grinding, brutal campaign of attrition. The British and French armies, fighting alongside each other, though not always in perfect coordination, threw wave after wave of men into the German lines. The Germans, defending their positions with the discipline and determination that characterized their army, held firm. The battle became a test of which side could sustain the greater losses while maintaining the will to continue fighting. The terrain itself became an enemy, as consequential as the German defenders. The Somme Valley, with its chalk soil and gentle slopes, turned into a muddy swamp as the summer progressed and rain began to fall. The bombardment had destroyed all vegetation and turned the earth into a cratered moonscape. Soldiers advanced through mud that reached their ankles, their knees, sometimes their waists. Wounded men sank into shell holes filled with water and drowned. The wounded who made it to the rear found themselves struggling through the same mud, their journey to safety measured in agonizing steps. The casualty figures mounted with a terrible consistency. In the first 2 weeks of July alone, the British suffered over 250,000 casualties. The French, attacking alongside the British, suffered over 100,000. The German defenders, while inflicting these devastating losses, also paid a price. The constant bombardment and repeated assaults ground down their defenders. Replacements arrived to fill the gaps in the lines, but the veteran soldiers who had held the trenches through the initial assault were increasingly gone, killed or wounded or simply exhausted beyond human endurance. By the middle of August, the battle had evolved into something different from what either side had anticipated. The grand breakthrough that British commanders had envisioned had not materialized. The German army had not collapsed under the weight of British and French attacks. Instead, both sides found themselves locked in a grinding war of attrition where territorial gains were measured in hundreds of yards and purchased with thousands of lives. The introduction of a new weapon in September marked a turning point of a different kind. The British, seeking some means to break the deadlock, deployed tanks for the first time in warfare. These armored vehicles, moving on tracked treads, were meant to cross no man's land, crush the barbed wire, and suppress the German defenders. The tanks appeared at Flers Courcelette on the 15th of September 1916. They were revolutionary in concept, but their execution was hampered by mechanical difficulties, poor coordination with the infantry, and the reality that German defenders, while shocked by their appearance, quickly learned that concentrated artillery fire and anti-tank rifles could damage or destroy them. The tanks made headlines and captured imaginations, but they could not transform the fundamental nature of the battle. The Somme remained a brutal, grinding affair where generals on both sides continued to believe that one more push, one more assault, one more sacrifice of soldiers' lives would achieve victory. The weather deteriorated as autumn approached. Rain fell steadily, turning the battlefield into a quagmire. The chalk mud clung to everything, making movement increasingly difficult. The trenches that soldiers had dug became water-filled ditches. Trench foot and disease began to claim as many men as German bullets. By October, the intensity of the fighting had diminished, though the battle continued. The initial ferocity had given way to a grim persistence. Soldiers attacked and defended, advanced and retreated, often over the same ground multiple times. The objectives had become smaller and more modest. No one spoke anymore of grand breakthroughs or decisive victories. The goal had become simply to maintain pressure on the German lines, to inflict losses, to slowly grind down the enemy's ability to resist. The casualty figures for the Somme campaign, when finally tallied, revealed the true scale of the catastrophe. The British army suffered between 419,000 and 420,000 casualties over the 141 days of the campaign. The French suffered approximately 194,000 to 204,000. The German defenders, while inflicting these losses, also suffered between 250,000 and 600,000 casualties, depending on which historical sources one consulted. Scholars continued to debate the exact figures, but all agreed on the essential fact. The Somme had been the costliest military campaign in human history to that date, yet the strategic results of this appalling sacrifice remained ambiguous. The British and French had advanced their lines, in some places by several miles. They had inflicted heavy casualties on the German army, but they had not broken through German defenses, had not achieved the decisive victory that would end the war, had not reached the objectives that the campaign planners had set when the bombardment began on the 24th of June, 1916. The men who survived the Somme, the soldiers who walked away from that terrible ground, carried with them a transformation that would mark them forever. They had experienced industrial warfare on a scale previously unimaginable. They had seen their friends, their comrades, their brothers killed in numbers that defied comprehension. They had advanced through fire and death, had held trenches under bombardment, had endured conditions that tested human physical and mental limits. On the 18th of November, 1916, the battle officially ended. The weather had become impossible, the ground a frozen mud that made further operations impractical. The armies settled into winter positions, exhausted, depleted, but unbroken. Neither side had achieved the victory it had sought. Both had sustained losses that would reshape their armies and test their nation's resolve to continue the war. The film that would be made of the Somme, the documentary record that would attempt to capture the battle for posterity, would struggle with a fundamental problem. How could images convey the scale of the slaughter? How could cinema capture the sound of machine gun fire, the smell of explosives and death, the overwhelming sensory experience of combat? The filmmakers who traveled to the Somme to document the battle faced a challenge that no artist had faced before: how to represent industrial warfare in a medium that was itself still learning its own language. The Somme had changed everything. It had revealed the true nature of 20th century warfare. It had demonstrated that courage and discipline, while necessary, were insufficient against machine guns and barbed wire and artillery. It had shown that generals, for all their planning and confidence, could be catastrophically wrong. And it had raised a question that would echo through the remainder of the war and into the peace that would follow. For what purpose had these hundreds of thousands of men been sacrificed? What had their deaths purchased? What victory, what strategic gain, what political objective could possibly justify such a cost? These questions hung over the Somme as the year 1916 drew to a close. The armies would fight on, the war would continue for 2 more years, but something fundamental had shifted. The optimism that had characterized the early stages of the First World War had been burned away in the mud of the Somme. What remained was a grimmer, harder understanding of what modern war demanded and what it cost. The men who had survived knew this truth in their bones. The nations that had sent them to fight would eventually come to understand it as well. The mud of the Somme did not release its grip easily. As autumn descended upon the battlefield in the months following that catastrophic 1st of July, the fighting continued with a grim persistence that would define the entire campaign. The British commanders, faced with the reality of their failed offensive, made the fateful decision to continue the assault rather than withdraw. They believed that breakthrough remained possible, that one more push would shatter the German lines. They were wrong. Throughout July and into August of 1916, successive waves of British and French soldiers advanced across terrain that had become increasingly treacherous. The preliminary bombardment, intended to destroy German defenses, had instead churned the earth into a labyrinth of shell craters and transformed the landscape into something almost unrecognizable. Soldiers advancing across this devastated ground found themselves struggling not only against German machine gun fire, but against the very earth beneath their feet. Wounded men sank into mud and water, unable to extricate themselves. The battlefield became a monument to human suffering on a scale that contemporary observers struggled to comprehend. By late September, the British command introduced a new weapon to the conflict: the tank. These armored vehicles, lumbering and mechanical, represented humanity's attempt to break the deadlock that had claimed so many lives. At the Battle of Flers-Courcelette in September of 1916, tanks appeared on a battlefield for the first time in military history. They advanced across the torn earth with a strange, almost otherworldly quality, their tracks crushing barbed wire and their guns engaging enemy positions. Yet even this technological innovation could not deliver the breakthrough that commanders desperately sought. The tanks, unreliable and slow, proved far less effective than the optimists had hoped. By October and November, as the weather deteriorated and the landscape transformed into a quagmire of mud and water, the intensity of the fighting diminished not from strategic choice, but from sheer exhaustion. When the Battle of the Somme officially ended on the 18th of November 1916, after 141 days of continuous combat, the human toll was almost incomprehensible. The British forces had sustained approximately 419,000 to 420,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. The French had endured approximately 194,000 to 204,000 casualties. The German forces, defending their positions with skill and determination, had also suffered catastrophically, and what had been gained, a few miles of territory, already devastated beyond utility, No strategic breakthrough, no decisive victory, only the terrible arithmetic of attrition. Yet this is where our narrative takes an unexpected turn, one that reveals something perhaps more troubling than the battle itself. The story of the Somme was not simply one of military failure and human tragedy. It became, in the years that followed, a story of how nations grapple with their most painful memories, how they choose to remember, or conversely, to forget. In 1916, while the battle raged, the British War Office commissioned a documentary film about the conflict. The project was revolutionary for its time. Never before had a major military operation been documented with such comprehensiveness. A team of cameramen, some of them soldiers themselves, worked to capture the reality of modern warfare. They filmed soldiers in the trenches, the artillery bombardment, the advance across no man's land. They gathered footage that would become the most significant documentary record of the Great War ever created. The resulting film, released in 1917, was titled The Battle of the Somme. It was shown in theaters throughout Britain and the Dominions, and it became the most widely viewed film of its era. Millions of people who had never seen a battle, who had no direct connection to the fighting, suddenly found themselves confronted with images of modern warfare. The film was shocking, unprecedented in its realism, yet it was also, in crucial ways, incomplete. The British authorities had carefully controlled what could and could not be filmed. Scenes of the most graphic suffering were absent. The reality of the wounded, the dying, the broken men being carried from the battlefield, much of this remained unseen. The film presented the Somme as a grim enterprise, certainly, but one that retained a sense of order and purpose. It showed soldiers advancing with discipline, artillery firing with precision, the machinery of war operating as designed. What it could not fully convey was the chaos, the terror, the absolute breakdown of human systems in the face of industrial-scale killing. In the decades that followed, the Somme became embedded in British consciousness not simply as a military event, but as a defining national trauma. The loss of so many men, drawn from every corner of the British Isles and the Empire, created a wound in the national psyche that did not heal. Every community had lost sons, brothers, fathers. The casualty lists were published in newspapers with a relentlessness that made the scale of loss impossible to ignore. Families received telegrams informing them that their loved ones had been killed or were missing, presumed dead. The grief was universal and profound. In the years immediately following the war, memorials were erected across Britain. Stone and bronze monuments rose in town squares and country churchyards, bearing the names of the fallen. The Somme became synonymous with the futility of the Great War, with the tragedy of a generation sacrificed for minimal territorial gain. Poets and writers gave voice to the anger and sorrow. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and others who had experienced the trenches produced works that captured the moral bankruptcy of the conflict. Their words ensured that the Somme would not be forgotten, that the sacrifice would be acknowledged as something more than a footnote in military history. Yet, even as the Somme was being memorialized and mourned, there emerged a curious phenomenon. The film itself, once so shocking and widely viewed, began to fade from public consciousness. It was not suppressed exactly, but it was gradually displaced by other narratives, other stories. The immediate trauma gave way to a kind of historical distance, and with that distance came a tendency to sanitize or obscure the most difficult truths. In 1916, when the Battle of the Somme was still ongoing, the film captured something unprecedented: the reality of modern warfare as it was actually experienced. The cameramen, working under dangerous conditions, documented not only the grand strategy of generals, but the lived experience of ordinary soldiers. They filmed men waiting in trenches, their faces showing fear and resignation. They captured the moment of going over the top, the scramble across torn earth toward enemy positions. They recorded the aftermath of bombardment, the devastation inflicted on the landscape. But the film also had limitations imposed by the technology and the sensibilities of the time. Some footage was censored, some was deemed too graphic for public viewing, some was simply lost over the decades. The result was that the film, while revolutionary, was also incomplete. It presented a version of the Somme that was real but not total, truthful but not exhaustive. This raises profound questions about how nations remember their wars, how they choose which truths to emphasize and which to downplay. The film, The Battle of the Somme, was not propaganda in the crude sense. It did not lie about what happened. Yet by its very nature as a selective document, it shaped how the Somme would be remembered. It presented one narrative among many possible narratives, and in doing so, it inevitably obscured other narratives. The soldiers who survived the Somme carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, then called shell shock. They had nightmares, struggled with anxiety, found it difficult to reintegrate into civilian life. Some turned to writing or art to process their experiences. Others remained silent, unable or unwilling to speak of what they had endured. Their voices, too, were part of the story of the Somme, yet they were often marginalized in the official narratives. The German soldiers who defended their positions at the Somme also suffered catastrophically, though their story has often been less prominent in British and French accounts. They faced the same artillery bombardment, the same waves of attacking infantry, the same impossible choices between holding their ground and preserving their lives. Many were conscripts, not volunteers, men who had been drafted into service and had no choice in their participation. Their suffering was no less real than that of the British and French, yet their voices were often absent from the memorials and commemorations that followed the war. In the years following 1918, when the Great War ended, the Somme took on an almost mythical quality in British culture. It became the symbol of the war's futility, the moment when the flower of British manhood was sacrificed for nothing. This narrative, while containing truth, also obscured other truths. The Somme was indeed a catastrophic failure of military strategy and leadership, but it was also a moment when millions of ordinary people endured extraordinary suffering with remarkable courage. It was a tragedy, but it was also a story of human resilience in the face of horror. The film, released in 1917 while the war was still ongoing, played a crucial role in shaping how the Somme would be remembered. It made the battle visible to those who had not experienced it. It brought the reality of modern warfare into theaters and homes across the empire, yet in doing so, it also mediated that reality, presenting it through the lens of film technology and the choices of cameramen and editors. The result was that subsequent generations would remember the Somme partly through the images they saw on screen, images that were real but also constructed, truthful but also selective. By the 1920s and 1930s, as the immediate trauma of the war faded, the Somme became increasingly romanticized. It was remembered not primarily as a catastrophic military failure, but as a moment of national sacrifice and heroism. This shift in memory served important psychological functions. It allowed survivors and the families of the fallen to find meaning in their loss, to believe that the sacrifice had not been entirely in vain. Yet it also obscured the genuine questions about military leadership, strategy, and the terrible costs of industrial warfare. The Second World War, when it came in 1939, presented a new challenge to the memory of the Somme. The earlier conflict had been marketed as the war to end all wars. Yet here was another war, even more destructive and terrible. The Somme, once the defining military trauma of the British experience, began to recede in public consciousness, displaced by new horrors and new sacrifices. Yet it remained embedded in the cultural memory, a touchstone for understanding the tragedy of modern warfare. In the decades after 1945, as Britain adjusted to its role as a diminished power, the Somme took on new significance. It became a symbol of British sacrifice in a great cause, of the nation's willingness to endure tremendous suffering in defense of its values. Yet, this narrative too was selective, emphasizing certain truths while downplaying others. The film The Battle of the Somme, once the most widely viewed documentary of its era, became less commonly screened. It was available to scholars and historians, but it no longer reached mass audiences. The late 20th century brought renewed interest in the Great War and the Somme specifically. Historians began to reassess the battle with new sophistication, examining not only the grand strategies of generals, but the lived experiences of soldiers. The film, rediscovered by a new generation of scholars and filmmakers, was recognized as an invaluable historical document. Yet even as it was being restored and preserved, questions remained about what it revealed and what it concealed. Today, more than a century after the events it recorded, the Battle of the Somme remains one of the most important documentary records of the Great War. It shows us what the Somme looked like to those who were there, how the battle appeared to the eyes of men working under extraordinary circumstances. Yet it also reminds us that all historical documents are incomplete, that all narratives are selective, that understanding the past requires looking beyond single sources to the multiplicity of perspectives and experiences. The legacy of the Somme is complex and contested. It was a military catastrophe that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. It was a moment of human courage and endurance. It was a failure of military leadership and strategy. It was a sacrifice that many believed gave meaning to the war effort. It was a tragedy that some believed should have led to different choices in subsequent conflicts. All of these things are true simultaneously. The film that documented the Somme, created during the battle itself, has become part of that legacy. It shaped how the battle would be remembered, what would be emphasized, what would fade from view. Yet in preserving one version of the Somme, it also preserved the possibility of questioning that version, of looking deeper into what happened on those mud-soaked fields in 1916. The film did not hide the bloodiest day in British military history, so much as present one particular way of seeing it, one narrative among the many that constitute our understanding of this defining moment in modern history. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to explore this piece of World War I history with me today. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep bringing these incredible stories to life. I'd love to hear what you think. Drop a comment below and let me know which part of this story resonated with you most. Your feedback genuinely matters to us. We've got so many more fascinating W1 stories coming your way, so stick around for those. There's always another chapter waiting to be discovered. Thanks again for being here. Stay curious and keep learning. See you next time.